The conference room went silent the second the first piano note played through the ceiling speakers. Claire Donovan felt her stomach drop through the floor. Her own voice, recorded at 1 a.m., filled the room. "I don't know how to tell you this, but I think about you more than I should." 12 coworkers stared at their laptops, frozen. Her boss, Adrian Cole, stood at the head of the table, remote in hand, his face unreadable. He hadn't pressed play by accident. He looked directly at her and said, "I think this file was meant to open before the quarterly deck." Claire couldn't breathe. If second-hand embarrassment is your love language, buckle up, because this one gets worse before it gets better. Subscribe now so you don't miss how this ends, and drop a comment telling me the most mortifying thing that's ever happened to you at work. I promise you, it won't beat this. 3 weeks earlier, Claire Donovan's life looked nothing like the disaster it was about to become. She was 28 years old, 2 years into a marketing coordinator role at a mid-sized architecture firm called Halbrook & Vance, and by every external measure, she was doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing. She showed up early. She stayed late when the deadlines demanded it. She kept a color-coded planner that made her manager's manager comment, more than once, that Claire was the kind of employee you build a department around. She had a small apartment on the edge of downtown, a plant collection she was slowly killing with love, and a very specific, very inconvenient problem that she had told absolutely no one about. She was in love with her boss. Not in the vague, harmless way people sometimes develop a crush on someone they work near. This was the kind of quiet, persistent, deeply inconvenient feeling that had been building for over a year, ever since Adrian Cole had transferred into the Portland office from the firm's Chicago branch to take over the design strategy division. He was 34, sharp in the particular way that came from being good at his job without needing anyone to tell him so, and he had a habit of remembering small details about people that made them feel, for a moment, like the only person in the building. He remembered that Claire took her coffee with oat milk. He remembered that she'd mentioned, once in passing, that she used to run track in college. He asked, during a Tuesday status meeting 6 months into his tenure, whether she'd ever thought about applying for the design communications lead role that had just opened up. And something about the way he said it, direct, certain, like he'd actually been paying attention, had lodged itself somewhere in her chest and never fully left. She had not acted on any of it. She was, by nature, a careful person, and she understood with total clarity the specific catastrophe that could unfold if a marketing coordinator developed feelings for the man who signed off on her performance reviews. So she did what careful people do. She buried it. She wrote about it, instead, in a battered spiral notebook she kept in the drawer of her nightstand, the same notebook she'd used since college to work through things she didn't know how to say out loud. And somewhere around the 8-month mark of pretending, she didn't notice the way Adrian's voice changed slightly when he talked about the projects he actually cared about. She had done something she hadn't done since she was 19 years old and heartbroken over a boy in her dorm building. She wrote a song. It wasn't supposed to be good. It wasn't supposed to be anything, really, except a release valve, a way to get the feeling out of her chest and onto paper where it couldn't hurt anyone, least of all her career. She had taught herself guitar in college badly and kept it up just enough that she could still fumble through a few chords when she needed to. Late on a Tuesday night, 3 weeks before the meeting that would upend everything, she sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor with her laptop open to a free recording program, guitar balanced across her knees, and she wrote 4 verses and a chorus about a man who didn't know he was the reason she smiled at her phone during meetings, about the specific ache of being good at hiding something you weren't sure you wanted to hide anymore. She recorded it in one take, her voice cracking slightly on the bridge in a way that embarrassed her enough to almost delete the whole thing. She named the file without much thought, the way she named everything on her laptop, at random, a string of letters that meant nothing to anyone but her file system. She saved it into a folder she used exclusively for late-night creative projects nobody else would ever see. She went to bed. She did not think about it again. What Claire didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that her laptop had synced to the company's shared cloud drive 20 minutes earlier, during an automatic backup she'd set up 8 months prior and completely forgotten existed, back when it had rolled out a company-wide policy requiring all work laptops to back up local files nightly for security compliance. The policy had been written for spreadsheets and project files, for the kind of documents that needed to survive a hard drive failure without anyone losing a week of billable work. Nobody in it had thought to specify that the backup should exclude a folder labeled, innocuously, personal music. because nobody at Halbrook and Vance had ever imagined an employee would use her assigned laptop to record a love song about her department head at 1 in the morning. The file synced quietly, sitting in a shared drive folder that, due to a permission setting nobody had audited in over a year, was visible, not prominently, not obviously, but visible to anyone in the design strategy division with folder access. Claire had no reason to check those permissions. She had no reason to think about the backup policy at all. She went to work the next morning the way she went to work every morning, coffee in one hand, laptop bag over her shoulder, completely unaware that somewhere in a folder she never opened during business hours, a recording of her own voice confessing feelings she had never once said aloud was sitting quietly, waiting. For 12 days, nothing happened. Claire went about her routine, sat through status meetings, exchanged the same easy, professional banter with Adrian that she always had, the kind of banter that had, for over a year now, felt like walking along the edge of something she refused to name. She had almost convinced herself the feeling was fading, the way she told herself it was fading roughly once a month, right up until he did something, remembered an offhand comment she'd made weeks earlier, or laughed at something she said in a way that reached his eyes, that reminded her exactly how far from fading it actually was. She had no idea that the file existed anywhere outside her own laptop. She had no idea that anyone else could possibly know. The trouble started, as trouble so often does, with something completely unrelated to Claire at all. Adrian was preparing for the firm's biggest pitch of the quarter, a presentation to a hospitality client considering Halbrook and Vance for a 12-building resort development, the kind of project that could define the firm's next 3 years if they landed it. He needed B-roll audio, ambient sound clips the design team had been collecting for months to use as atmospheric background during the client's video walkthrough of the proposed site, recordings of wind through trees, water against rocks, the kind of textured soundscape that made a pitch deck feel like an experience instead of a slideshow. Those recordings lived in the same shared drive, in a folder adjacent to the one Claire's backup had quietly populated without her knowledge. On the Thursday before the pitch, running behind and reviewing files at his desk after most of the office had gone home, Adrian's cursor slipped one folder over while he was scrolling too quickly through a directory tree he didn't fully know the layout of. He saw a list of audio files he didn't recognize, one of them dated 3 weeks earlier, named with a string of characters that meant nothing to him, sitting in what appeared, at a glance, to be a general audio assets folder. He clicked it, expecting wind or water, or the ambient hum the sound team had recorded at the coastal site. What played instead was a woman's voice, slightly nervous, slightly cracking, singing about a man who had no idea what he did to her when he remembered small things nobody else bothered to notice. He didn't recognize her voice at first, not immediately. It took nearly the full length of the first verse before something in his chest went very still, before the specific cadence of a laugh he'd heard nearly every day for over a year clicked into place against the melody. He sat at his desk long after the song ended, the office empty around him except for the hum of the building's ventilation system, staring at the file name on his screen, replaying it once, then a second time, then a third, not because he needed to confirm what he already knew, but because some part of him wasn't ready for the confirming to be over. He did not sleep well that night. He told himself, lying awake at 2 a.m. staring at his ceiling, that the professional thing to do, the only responsible thing to do, was to quietly delete the file, adjust the permissions himself so nothing like it could ever surface again, and never mention it to anyone, least of all Claire. He told himself that for most of the following day. And then, sometime around mid-afternoon, watching her across the conference table during a routine project check-in, laughing at something a coworker said in a way that reached all the way to her eyes, he found himself thinking about the bridge of the song, the part where her voice had cracked, the specific words she'd used, and he understood with a clarity that unsettled him more than he wanted to admit, that he did not actually want to forget it. He wanted, if he was being honest with himself for the first time in longer than he could remember, to know if she meant every word. He did not act on that impulse immediately either. Adrian Cole was, like Claire, a careful person, and he understood exactly how badly this could go if he handled it wrong for her career, for his own position, for the fragile professional trust that made a department function. He spent the better part of a week turning the problem over in his mind, the way careful people do, looking for a version of this that didn't end in disaster. He thought about pulling her aside privately, telling her he'd stumbled onto the file, apologizing for the accidental discovery, and quietly letting the conversation go wherever it wanted to go from there. It was the obvious choice. It was the kind, careful, low-stakes choice. It was not, in the end, the choice he made, because on the Monday morning of the week the hospitality pitch was due. An entirely different, entirely unrelated catastrophe collided with his plan and rewrote it completely. The firm's IT department, doing a routine audit ahead of a compliance review, had flagged the exact same folder permissions issue that had let Claire's file sync where it shouldn't have, and sent out an automated notice to every department head that shared drive folders would be reorganized and repermissioned by end of week, with a note recommending managers review any personal files that might have inadvertently synced before the migration wiped local backups clean. Adrian read the notice with a specific kind of dread. If he didn't say something before Friday, the file might disappear from the shared drive entirely during the migration, and with it, any chance he had of raising the conversation the way he'd been quietly planning to. He realized, 1 week left to figure out what to do, and somewhere in the tangle of that pressure and the pitch deadline bearing down on the entire department at the same time, he made a decision that felt, in the moment, clever in a way that only made sense to a man who had been awake at 2 a.m. turning a single song over in his head for 6 straight nights. He decided he would let her know he'd found it, not privately, not with an apology and an awkward hallway conversation, but in a way that gave her room to see his reaction before she had to say anything at all. He built it into the quarterly meeting agenda himself, late Thursday night, adding a placeholder slide before the actual presentation deck titled simply Audio Test, Please Disregard. A slide, he told himself, was meant to open the meeting quietly, a small aside before real business began, a way to let the moment exist in the room without either of them having to name it directly first. He told himself, right up until the moment he stood at the head of the conference table Friday morning with the remote in his hand, that he still might change his mind. Claire walked into that Friday meeting with absolutely no sense that anything unusual was coming. It was the standard mid-morning department check-in, the kind of meeting she'd sat through dozens of times, 12 people around a long table with laptops open and coffee going cold. Adrian at the head running through the week's priorities before the bigger pitch presentation later that afternoon. She'd worn the blazer she liked, the navy one, because she had a habit of dressing slightly better on days she knew she'd see him, a habit she'd never fully examined and wasn't about to start examining now. She took her usual seat, 3 chairs down from the head of the table, opened her laptop, and settled in for what she expected to be 20 unremarkable minutes before she could get back to the campaign brief sitting half-finished on her desk. Adrian opened the meeting the way he always did, running through the week's updates in the same steady, competent voice she'd spent over a year quietly falling for, and Claire relaxed into the familiar rhythm of it, the low hum of a normal Friday. Then he paused, glanced down at his laptop, and said, in a tone so casual it almost didn't register as strange, "Before we get into the deck, there's a stray audio file that got mixed into our shared assets during last week's sync. I want to play the first few seconds just to confirm it's not something we need for the pitch." He said it lightly, the way you'd mention a scheduling conflict or a printer error, and around the table people barely looked up from their laptops. Claire barely looked up either. It took her exactly 4 seconds, the length of a single guitar intro. 4 chords she had played hundreds of times alone in her bedroom. Chords that lived nowhere else in the world except in a file she had never, not once, imagined leaving her own laptop. To understand, with a wave of cold horror that started in her chest and spread outward so fast she felt it in her fingertips, exactly what was about to happen. Her own voice filled the room. Nervous, unpolished, cracking slightly on a note she'd meant to hit cleanly, singing words she had written specifically because she never intended another living person to hear them. I don't know how to tell you this, but I think about you more than I should. The room, which had been half distracted, scattered across laptops and half-finished coffees, went completely, suffocatingly still. Claire felt every eye at the table shift toward her, not because anyone said her name, not yet, but because something in the specific, unmistakable intimacy of the recording made it obvious, immediately, whose voice it was and roughly who it might be about. She stared at her laptop screen, unable to look up, unable to move, her pulse hammering so loudly in her ears she could barely hear the second verse start. Adrian did not stop the recording immediately. He let it play for nearly 15 seconds, watching Claire's face the entire time, and it was in that 15 seconds that she finally understood this was not, in fact, an accident. Nobody accidentally opens a file mid-meeting and lets it play for 15 seconds in front of 12 people. She looked up at him then, her face burning, and found him watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately place. Not amusement, not cruelty, something quieter and more deliberate than either of those. He reached for the remote and paused the playback mid-line, the recording cutting off on a word that hung in the silence of the conference room like something physical. 12 coworkers sat frozen, laptops forgotten, several of them looking anywhere but at Claire out of the specific second-hand mortification of watching someone else's private moment detonate in a professional setting. Adrian set the remote down on the table. "I think this file was meant to open before the quarterly deck," he said, and his voice was even, careful, giving nothing away to the rest of the room. But his eyes, when they found Claire's, held something that made her stomach drop through the floor for an entirely different reason than the one that had put it there 30 seconds earlier. She could not breathe. She could not, for several long seconds, do anything except sit very still and calculate, with the frantic precision of someone doing damage control in real time, exactly how bad this was, exactly how many people in that room now knew something she had spent over a year making absolutely certain no one would ever find out. The meeting did not end there, though Claire would later remember almost nothing about the 20 minutes that followed. Adrian, with a composure that would only make sense to her much later, moved directly into the actual agenda, running through the week's project updates as though nothing unusual had happened at all, giving the rest of the room permission, implicitly, to do the same. People shuffled their laptops, cleared their throats, gradually returned their attention to the deck on the screen, though Claire could feel, even without looking, the occasional glance flicker toward her and away again, quick and uncomfortable, the specific social choreography of people who have just witnessed something they don't know how to acknowledge. She sat through the remaining 15 minutes of that meeting in a kind of frozen, dissociated fog, nodding at appropriate moments, saying nothing, feeling the blazer she'd worn because she liked how it looked on days she'd see him now feel like something closer to a costume she desperately wanted to take off. When the meeting finally ended and people began filing out, murmuring about lunch plans and the afternoon pitch, careful not to make eye contact with her, Claire stayed in her seat, staring at her closed laptop, trying to work out whether the correct move was to leave immediately or wait until the room emptied so she wouldn't have to walk out under 12 pairs of eyes. Adrian solved the problem for her. He waited by the door until the last person left, then closed it quietly, the click of the latch loud in the sudden silence, and turned to face her from across the room. "I owe you an explanation," he said. Claire finally found her voice, and it came out sharper than she intended, equal parts humiliation and genuine anger. "You owe me a lot more than an explanation. You just played that in front of the entire department." "I know," he said, and he didn't flinch from it, didn't offer excuses, just stood there and let the accusation land the way it deserved to. "I found the file 11 days ago. It synced through the backup policy it rolled out last spring, the one nobody read the fine print on. I found it by accident, looking for B-roll audio for the resort pitch." Claire felt her face go hot all over again, a different kind of horror layering over the first. 11 days, she repeated. "You've had it for 11 days and you decided the right move was to play it in a meeting." "No," he said quickly, and for the first time since the recording had started, something cracked in his composure, something that looked almost like nerves. I didn't plan to play the whole thing. I built in that slide because I didn't know how else to tell you I'd heard it, and I was a coward about it, and I let it run longer than I should have because—" He stopped himself. "Because what?" Claire said, and her voice had gone quiet now, some of the anger draining out of it, replaced by something more uncertain, more exposed. Adrian was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Claire genuinely wasn't sure he was going to answer at all. "Because I've listened to it more than 11 times, he said finally, "and I wanted to see your face when you realized I knew. I told myself for a week I was going to handle this like an adult and pull you aside privately, and then it sent out a migration notice saying the file might get wiped by Friday, and I panicked, and I did something that was, objectively, one of the worst professional decisions I've made in my career." He rubbed a hand across his jaw, the gesture of a man who knew exactly how badly he'd handled something and had no path left except honesty. "I am not going to pretend that was fair to you." "It wasn't, I'm sorry." Claire sat with that for a long moment, turning it over, trying to reconcile the version of Adrian who had just detonated her most private secret in front of a room full of coworkers with the version standing in front of her now, visibly uncomfortable, visibly aware of exactly how much damage he'd done. You could have just deleted it, she said quietly. You could have never said anything at all. I could have, he agreed. I thought about it. For about 4 days, that's exactly what I told myself I was going to do. So why didn't you? He looked at her directly then, and something in his expression made her chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with humiliation anymore. Because I didn't want to spend the next year of my life wondering whether you meant it, he said. And I was fairly confident you were never going to tell me on your own. She wanted badly to be furious with him, to hold on to the clean, simple anger of being exposed in front of 12 coworkers without her consent. And some part of that anger was entirely justified and would take her a long time to fully let go of. But sitting there in the empty conference room, the blazer she'd worn suddenly feeling less like a costume and more like exactly what it was, she found that anger tangled up inescapably with something else, the specific, disorienting relief of no longer having to carry the thing alone. You humiliated me, she said, and it wasn't an accusation anymore so much as a statement of fact she needed him to hear clearly. I know, he said. I'm not going to ask you to forgive how I handled it. That's mine to sit with. But you're not sorry it happened, she said slowly, working out the shape of what he'd actually said. He didn't answer right away, which was, in itself, an answer. The following days did not resolve neatly. Claire spent the weekend cycling between mortification and a strange, unfamiliar lightness she didn't entirely trust, replaying the conversation in the conference room, replaying the 15 seconds the song had played before he paused it, wondering how many of her coworkers had already pieced together exactly what they'd heard and who it was about. Monday morning was excruciating in a specific, low-grade way. A few too careful smiles in the break room. One coworker who very deliberately did not mention the previous Friday at all, which somehow felt worse than if she had. Claire got through it the way she got through most difficult things, by working harder than necessary and keeping her office door mostly closed. And she told herself, more than once that week, that whatever had cracked open between her and Adrian in that empty conference room would probably close itself back up given enough time and enough professional distance. It did not close up. Adrian found reasons over the following 2 weeks to stop by her desk that had nothing to do with the campaign brief or the resort pitch, reasons that grew progressively thinner and more transparent, until finally, on a Thursday evening when most of the office had cleared out and the building had gone quiet the way it always did after 6, he knocked on the frame of her open office door and asked, without any preamble at all, whether she'd have dinner with him. Not a work dinner. Not a debrief. He was specific about that, standing in her doorway with his hands in his pockets, looking less composed than she had ever seen him in over a year of working together. I know how this looks, he said. I know I'm the reason this whole thing became complicated in the first place, but I've spent 2 weeks trying to figure out how to say this professionally, and I don't think there's a professional way to say it, so I'm just going to say it badly instead. I want to take you to dinner. Not because of the song. Because of you, and the song just happened to be the thing that finally made me stop pretending I hadn't already noticed. Claire sat with that for a long moment, looking at him standing in her doorway, thinking about the 4 seconds of guitar intro that had upended her carefully controlled life 3 weeks earlier, thinking about how much simpler things would have been if that backup policy had simply excluded her personal folder the way it should have, and thinking, underneath all of it, about the fact that some part of her, the part that had written that song at 1 in the morning because she couldn't hold the feeling in any longer, had never actually wanted it to stay buried forever. This is an enormous professional risk for both of us, she said finally, because it needed to be said out loud, plainly, before anything else could happen. It is, he agreed. I've thought about that too. I don't have a clean answer for how we handle it. I just know I'd rather figure it out than spend another year watching you across a conference table pretending I don't. She almost laughed, despite everything, at the specific absurdity of 2 people in their 30s who ran project budgets and client pitches for a living being reduced to this, standing in an office doorway after hours, neither of them entirely sure how to say the thing plainly. Dinner, she said finally. But if you ever play one of my private files in a meeting again, I will end your career and mine on principle. They figured out the complicated parts slowly, the way careful people do, a conversation with HR that Adrian initiated himself before things went any further. A temporary restructuring of reporting lines that moved Claire under a different project lead within the month. The kind of quiet, deliberate transparency that turned what could have been a scandal into, eventually, just a story people at the firm told each other with a laugh at the holiday party. The one about the marketing coordinator whose secret love song got played in a Friday status meeting. Claire cringed every single time someone brought it up for the better part of a year, and then, slowly, stopped cringing and started telling it herself, because somewhere along the way it had stopped being the most humiliating thing that had ever happened to her and become, instead, the accident that finally forced two careful people to stop being careful. She still has the notebook, the battered spiral one from her nightstand drawer, and she still writes in it, though these days what she writes doesn't have to stay hidden the way it once did. She never did delete the recording, and neither did Adrian. It sits still in a folder neither of them has bothered to move, a strange little artifact of the worst and best Friday morning of her professional life. Proof that sometimes the thing you spend the most energy trying to keep buried is the exact thing that was always meant to find its way into the light. However badly, however publicly, however completely out of your control the timing turns out to be. If this story made you laugh, made you cringe, or made you think about the message you never sent, tell me about it in the comments, because I promise you're not alone. And if you believe the most mortifying moments in life sometimes turn out to be the ones that change everything, hit subscribe, because there are so many more stories like this one still to come.